Before we talk about the steps and stages of cellular respiration, I want to introduce why cells undergo cellular respiration and just really generally how it works. So first, an introduction to the process itself. All of the energy that is used on Earth originates from the sun. And we don't talk about photosynthesis in here, but the sun produces all kinds of different wavelengths of energy, and the pigment molecules in photosynthesizing organisms can absorb that sunlight energy and take carbon dioxide, which is our source of carbon, and water, a source of hydrogen, and the electrons associated with hydrogen, combine them together, so rearrange the atoms of these two molecules and put energy into bonds between carbon and hydrogen and produce organic molecules. So basically what they're doing is they're converting sunlight energy, which can't be directly applied to any kind of process or any kind of cellular process, and they're storing it up as organic molecules, which is a form of potential energy. And one of the byproducts of that is oxygen. So these organic molecules are available, a form of potential energy, lots of energy in the electron sharing between carbon and hydrogen atoms. Then organisms, eukaryotic organisms, will extract the energy from those organic molecules in the mitochondrion. Now, prokaryotic organisms can extract the energy too, but they just don't use the mitochondrion. It all happens in the cytoplasm because there are no or membrane-bound organelles in prokaryotic cells. So what's going to happen in the mitochondrion is the organic molecules are going to be combined, or the atoms and electrons of organic molecules are going to be recombined with oxygen to release that energy, about 30% of what was in there. We're going to release it as ATP, and that's a molecule that's again storing potential energy. The result of cellular respiration, the production of ATP, is a byproduct of CO2 and H2O, which of course is used in photosynthesis. So we're always having this input of sunlight energy. We're ultimately creating ATP to drive cellular processes and always contributing to the second law of thermodynamics, or obeying that law, by releasing most of the energy that was found in the molecules as heat. So we're not generating energy from scratch, we're just converting it from one form to another. And remember, even plants need mitochondria, plural, sorry. They can make their own organic molecules, but then to extract the ATP, or to produce ATP from them, they also need mitochondria. So in all of our cells, our trillions of cells, we've got these mitochondria going through cellular respiration, producing CO2, H2O, and then ATP. So it's not just muscle cells, it's all cells. And the byproduct CO2 has to be removed. We also have to constantly bring in oxygen in order to go through cellular respiration. So something we don't really think about is, why do we breathe? And some people will get to the point where they say, because we need oxygen. But the question is, why do we need oxygen? And the reason why we need oxygen, why we bring in oxygen through breathing, is so that we can continually generate ATP. Then we also breathe to exhale and get rid of the byproduct, CO2. We don't want too much CO2 in our system. So the reason why we breathe and the reason why we bring in oxygen is so that we can produce ATP and sustain all of our energy requiring cellular processes. Now, ATP has those three phosphate groups with lots of energy in between in the covalent bonds holding the phosphates together. Hydrolysis of ATP, so releasing just one of those phosphates, just one is released, releases what we call 7.6 kilocal per mole of energy. Mole is a unit of measurement for molecules, and we won't go into how we determine what a mole is, but it's just a unit of, it's like a unit of mass. And the kilocalories per mole, measuring the kilocalories per mole, tells us how much energy is found in a compound. Now, reactions either require kilocalories or they release kilocal. And the hydrolysis of ATP releases 7.6 kilocalories per mole of energy. Now, there are plenty of reactions that require an input of energy. They require some number of kilocalories per mole of energy. ATP couples the exergonic cellular respiration reactions. So we make like in the 30s, it depends on the round of cellular respiration, but maybe like 34 ATP for every breakdown of glucose. So imagine 34 of these times 7.6 kilocalories, that's how much energy we have from one molecule of glucose. Then reactions that require energy might require some number of ATPs based on how many kilocalories per mole of energy that reaction requires. Now remember, using ATP to drive some kind of endergonic reaction is really hydrolyzing ATP, releasing a phosphate, and then attaching that phosphate to the substrate of the reaction. So ATP and substrates were the reactants in the chemical reaction. The products then will be ADP, and then also this substrate that now has a phosphate attached to it. And attaching that phosphate is what actually causes the work to happen. So when something is described as being endergonic or requiring some amount of energy, it's requiring something to happen because of the attachment of a phosphate group usually. So ATP hydrolysis is what's used to perform the work. In the book, we've got a list of how many kilocalories are consumed per hour by a person who's like 150 pounds, running 979 kilocalories of energy. And this is actually not including all of the energy that's required just to keep cells surviving. And when you guys think about calories, don't think of them as kilocalories. Calories, when people say like, oh, this burger is 600 calories, they're saying kilocalories. And I don't actually know why we've converted from saying kilocalories to calories, but they're the same as kilocalories. It's just in science we use the term kilocalories because we use everything based on the metric system. All right, so ATP is what is going to be used to drive everything that costs this much energy. So 28 kilocalories per hour if you're just sitting. Every ATP that's hydrolyzed provides 7.6 kilocalories of energy. That's just for sitting per hour, not taking into account all of the kilocalories that are needed for each cell to survive. Now, the general formula for cellular respiration, I've been saying for one molecule of glucose, we get some number of ATP. That's when we go through cellular respiration, one molecule of glucose is what we're going to look at in the conversion of glucose to ATP. For every one molecule of glucose, we need 6 molecules of oxygen, and we're going to produce 6 molecules of CO2, 6 molecules of water, ATP, and heat. And we'll see how many ATP and why the number can vary a little bit. But the overall formula for cellular respiration, including the number of molecules of each type, is something that you need to remember, especially for future if you're going to take the A&P or something related to health-related sciences. Now, what's happening in this process is the molecule of glucose is going to be just stripped apart, picked apart slowly but surely, and the energy that's in all the carbon-hydrogen bonds here is going to be ultimately put into ATP. It's going to be released and put into ATP. The hydrogen that's found in glucose is going to end up attaching to oxygen to create water. Carbon is going to lose those hydrogen and be ultimately only with oxygen in CO2. So there's a loss of hydrogen atoms from carbon. There's a gain of hydrogen atoms to oxygen. The loss of hydrogen atoms is considered what we call an oxidation. Carbon becomes oxidized. The gain of hydrogen atoms is a reduction. Oxygen will become reduced. These two are super low energy molecules. All the energy by the time this process is done will have been released and put into ATP, or released as heat. Oxidation and reduction is actually not usually defined as a loss or gain of hydrogen atoms. It's usually described as a loss or a gain of electrons. So if you were to Google or look up the definition of oxidation or reduction, the loss of electrons is oxidation. The gain of electrons is reduction. But we're constantly seeing a movement of hydrogen in the story of cellular respiration. And hydrogen is bringing with it one electron. So when we say loss of hydrogen atoms, we're referring to the loss of the electron, the high energy electron associated with hydrogen. Ultimately, the hydrogen attached to oxygen will no longer have a high energy electron. The electron will have gotten rid of all of its energy, which has been put into ATP, or lost as heat. And we'll see how that happens later in the process. One of the molecules that's important in that process is a molecule called NAD+. NAD+ is going to be an energy carrier. So here's our little organic molecule with high energy electrons between carbon and hydrogen. And when this molecule becomes oxidized, remember, it loses hydrogen. So let's see, this is a reaction that's caused a loss of 2 hydrogen atoms. The hydrogen atoms are going to become attached to NAD+. NAD+ will then become reduced and be NADH. And it can pick up actually 2 electrons out of the 2 hydrogen atoms, and there'll be 1 little proton left. And this NADH is carrying high energy electrons from all kinds of different reactions in cellular respiration, but ultimately NADH will dump off those electrons to a process called the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is just a series of proteins that one by one grab the electrons. And every time the electrons are grabbed by a member of the electron transport chain, the energy associated with them is lower and lower, until finally the electron transport chain drops off electrons to the process of fusing protons, oxygen, and electrons to make water as the byproduct of cellular respiration. These electron transport chain proteins just hold the electrons in a lower and lower energy state, and the energy is released to drive the synthesis of ATP, which is another product of cellular respiration. So ultimately, cellular respiration is going to happen in the mitochondrion. And the mitochondria have all the enzymes and molecules that are needed for cellular respiration. We're going to look at 4 pieces: glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, and then something called the oxidative phosphorylation or electron transport. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. Everything else is going to happen in the mitochondrion. And what we're going to do next is look at the phases of cellular respiration.